So today I want to talk about this. In the TypeScript and React world, the go-to component library is Shadcn, which is nice because it gives you the ability to just copy and paste the actual, let's go to a button, the actual code into your application. So you have ownership of it and you can change the styles however you want. And what they offer is just the functionality, and everything else is up to you to customize however you want. However, because this change in component library usage makes it a little difficult in a library like, or in ClojureScript specifically, and other languages that wrap React to use for the UI. So today I kind of want to go over how you could incorporate Shadcn components into a ClojureScript application. Now, what I have is a bare bones Reagent thing set up. I'm using Reagent because, as far as I know, it's still the de facto React wrapper in ClojureScript. But I'm pretty sure this, or all the information I present, is going to be applicable to Helix, UIX, Fulcro, and any other ones that I may have missed. But just to quickly go over the starting point of this code base, for the Clojure side, I have a deps.eden package or Clojure tools, whichever you prefer to call it. The Clojure side, there's no server, it just prints hello world. On the ClojureScript side, I have a pretty simple Shadow-CLJS configuration. We're targeting the deps client, so this is where, so that all of our Clojure and ClojureScript dependencies can live in one place. The ClojureScript REPL is going to be on 9001, and then our dev environment is going to be on port 9000. And then for the DevTools stuff, the output directory, all the code's going to be compiled to public.js inside the resource directory, so that in our index.html, it will be loaded in this script tag. And then finally, in our core.cljs, or actually before this, I do have to mention, in this example, I'm using React 19. So for Reagent, that means that we have to specify a root from Reagent DOM client, because I believe in the previous versions of Reagent, you did have to interrupt with that before React split apart the root's entry point. But this root targets the div with the ID of app in our index.html, and every time we reload the application, this is for hot reloading, when we make changes into our code, we'll render our app or our application code into the root, and the init is just gonna call reload. So this is all standard ClojureScript and Reagent stuff. Hopefully not too mind-blowing. And from here, we can just start the application because in my npm package, I have both a watch and build script, but we're just gonna do Shadow-CLJS watch app. But in the terminal, I'm just gonna type in npm run dev. And once the REPL starts and builds, our application should look something like this. Our application should look something like this, which is not super pretty. But that does lead me to our first step, which is for Shadcn and all the other inspired component libraries, we need Tailwind. And since recently Tailwind upgraded to version 4, the setup is a little different than before, so I feel like it's worth exploring here. So let's just go to the docs, and we're doing an installation, and we're just using the raw Tailwind CLI. So if you just run through these steps, things will pretty much work on its own. And to go over that step, for npm, you're going to want to install Tailwind CSS. The CLI has a dev dependency, and then optionally npm run all. The run all is mostly for the build scripts, and I'm not sure why in npm I had to run npx inside of the script, but I was having trouble with that, so I mean that was a quick fix for me. But -i is the input CSS and -o is the output. It looks like I forgot to build, so let's just do it npm run build CSS, and that will give us the output CSS over here. But I do want to go over that in Clojure, there's a type of naming convention or directory convention, which is inside your source directory, you separate your code by the extension type. And you'll see this in larger applications or full stack applications where I'll separate Clojure, ClojureScript, and CLJS files when it's being shared in a full stack environment. So as an extension to that, I thought it would make sense to also put your source CSS file in the source directory. But the only difference that I want to mention in this part of the video is that I also added the import source. I don't know what this is called actually, a directive maybe? This line here says that Tailwind will only watch all the files that are in the source directory for changes in styles and class names, I mean. And this is because if you're doing a watch, Tailwind will watch all of the files in your root directory, and we don't want Tailwind to watch the output CSS. That might lead to an infinite loop. So just to be safe, let's just watch only the code that we're editing. And then finally, make sure to update your index.html with the file path to the output CSS file. And that way, when we go back to package.json and we do a run dev, we get to watch both the ClojureScript code and the CSS code. And then the optional package here of npm run all, the -p just means that it'll run both jobs in parallel, because there is an option to watch these jobs is in sequential order. But then with all of that, if we just rerun dev, our HTML should be updated to, well, once we reload actually, to have the new styles. I actually forgot that I did this off screen, but I added some new styles to the root application. So let's add some more styles just to show it. I don't know, do font bolds, and we'll just make the font even, or the text even bigger. So like so, and that should show up like this. Okay, so now let's move on to Shadcn. And the tab that we're going to pay attention to is the manual installation. We will come back here in a little bit, but all I want right now is the global styles, because we're going to paste that into our index.css, like so. We don't need this first line because we already have it from the Tailwind setup. And then also from the second line, well, we actually need that one library, so we might as well npm install it. Nah, you know what, let's just grab everything. We'll go over it later. But as always, paste it in. We have class variance authority, CLSX, Tailwind merge, Lucid React, and Tailwind animate CSS. Now from here, to use any component in Reagent, the first option that we have is to just translate it. And some of it is more straightforward than others, but I'm gonna go with the most common component that you're gonna probably want, and it's gonna be the button. And thankfully in Shadcn, during the copy and paste, you could actually just read it. And while you read it, you can slowly translate this over into a Reagent component. But essentially, the thing that you need to pay attention to is the class names and what props is being given. So here I'm in a new namespace called the app.components. A lot of Shadcn's components uses a utility function that they call cn, and essentially it composes the Tailwind class names for each component so that there's no conflicts, and it results in the component being rendered correctly without any duplicate classes. Here we have a straight translation, but because we're in ClojureScript, we don't actually need CLSX, and that's because in Clojure, our code is smart enough to know what is a truthy and non-truthy string, so we could compose class names with just the Clojure logic. We will still need Tailwind merge, because this function actually strips out all the duplicate class names. Alright, but now back to the button. So essentially when you translate a Shadcn component, or any React component for that matter, over to Reagent, it will follow a similar structure of changing into a Clojure function with props and children as the arguments. And we can wrap this in a let binding so that we can destructure class and props, or the rest of the props, for what we're providing. And then before we port over all the styles, we're gonna want to pass it into the resulting reagent component as a merge of the old props and then what we're adding to it in this function. So back in here, and then we're just gonna grab all of this and then translate it, and we'll be back. Okay, it's all lined up. But essentially, this is the Shadcn button ported over. And to use it, let's just go back to our core. No, I am in the wrong place. This needs to be a ClojureScript component. Let's just close out the Clojure side and never touch it. But at this point, let's import this into our core namespace. And I'm gonna change this, or actually I'm just gonna wrap it. All right, let's see what that looks like. Of course it's off. There it is. There's our actual button that we ported over. Let's also make sure that it works with interactions. So I'm just gonna add an onClick with the event that will just log out clicked. And back in the app, let's click the button. So boop, 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 boop. And it's working, good. So to explain how this works, in a sense, the Shadcn button uses class variance authority, which allows you to pass in other props to define which class name to append onto the base class. And they also do define a default for those variants. What we're doing here is, instead of relying on the library, we're just doing it ourselves. So we destructure variant and size, both of which are a map of the underlying extra class names. And down here, we're getting the specific class name from the full map if the prop is provided, and if not, we just get the default. And then finally, this merge will take the remaining props, update the class property, and then merge them together. This second map being placed here is important because it is gonna overwrite the original property of class in the first map that's in merge, because it goes sequentially in order. And also order matters in the CN portion as well, because we always want the final class to overwrite whatever came before it. And let's check if our class name overwriting stuff makes or works. So I just want teal 500 and then text white. And that should update the button, which it does. But it should still have the hover effect, which it still does, so that's good. Now I do want to move on to some other components where it'll show some difficulties with just translating a component straight from React to Reagent. And we're going to start with the popover component. So this requires Radix UI, so you can go ahead and copy and paste this and do an npm install, like so, and that should get it going. Now if you go through down all of this, the only component that we actually want that is somewhat customized is the content, the popover content. Everything else we can just call from Radix UI and just call it as it is. Now first I'm going to show the naive approach, which is this. So I imported it in as popover, as we'll get the entire module, whereas refer is importing just one specific export. And then I've already basically wrote down what we think we see in Shadcn. So the popover is our root, the trigger is the trigger, and then the content, basically destructuring the props and using the base classes as we did with our button. And then in case I didn't mention it, this hiccup syntax is how we call, or how we interop with React components. So a colon greater than, no less, no, it's greater than. And then we go ahead and just make or draft out a simple popover. Essentially, this is how you want to use it. We just need to fill in the children. And with this, we would expect it to work as intended. Also, Shadcn, or actually Radix instead, wants the popover trigger to be as child, because for accessibility reasons, because the trigger itself is already a button. So if you want the children inside of it to be a button, you should pass it downward. So from here, we would expect this to work, but if you click on it, nothing's happening. And the reason here is, well, a couple things. So first of all, popover trigger expects its children to be a React component, but we're actually passing in a Reagent component. And this is important because it's not able to pass in the children's props into its child. So we change this to a reagent component, and now that props is optional, we can also get rid of the middle part. I believe this should still render, but it won't be able to display the content. So it's rendering. You can see that we no longer have the styles because we're passing in a native HTML element without any styling on it. But now we can't click it. We could check that it is a button though. And if you do click it, you'll see that the popover works correctly, but the content doesn't. The state is changing, so I don't know if you're seeing that. And the explanation for that is because the popover and the trigger, if we go in, we're wrapping it in a closure function. So these are actually turning into reagent components and not React components. So we can fix this by just changing this to the raw root and trigger. And as mentioned, the content is the only thing that we actually styled. So at this point, I believe everything works correctly. So now, if we click, there's our popover. And once again, this has to do with the parent needing to pass in certain props to its children, which can sometimes work and sometimes not work, depending on what props it is. There is more information in the reagent docs on how to interact with React. I just want to mention this, that it's not as intuitive as you may think by just reading the JSX. So if you're stubborn and want to only translate, have at it, but it's gonna lead to a lot of headaches. And there is one more complication that I want to bring up, which is the practice of render props. And thankfully, that practice has died down a lot since hooks was introduced to React. But I believe the only component in Shadcn that has render props is the calendar. And if we look in the source code, the render prop exists here in components. As you can see, you pass in an object that has keys that leads to essentially a React component. So it takes in props and it spits out JSX. It was a very popular pattern back in the day, so there is documentation on how to do it, and it's in Material UI. But essentially what happens is that you have to reactify your reagent component and then pass it into the reagent-defined React component. So this interrupt can be quite annoying. So there's another solution to using all these Shadcn components, and it'll also allow you to make use of the Shadcn CLI, and that's what we're gonna get into next. So we're back at the manual installation, and this is because we're essentially going to make our own NPM package, a personal one, where we could create and modify our React components directly. Now we've already gone through a couple of these steps to set up our project earlier. All we need to do now is to do the other steps. Mainly, we need a tsconfig. We've already added our CSS styles, but if you haven't, you should copy and paste this one. We're gonna come back to this libs thing in a bit, but we also want the components.json here. So here's the components.json. The tsconfig, I essentially just took the base tsconfig from another project, but I did add these 4 lines here. The out directory here is important because this is where we're gonna compile our personal NPM package. Now you can put it in a packages directory in the root or some other package. You just need to keep that in mind when you update the Shadow-CLJS.eden file, because we're gonna add these 2 lines. And the JS packagers option will tell Shadow which files to look for when resolving NPM packages. Also of note, you don't want to put things inside your node modules because NPM will automatically delete or add things or change things up based on the command line stuff. So you do want it in a directory that you have control over yourself. And then this ESM option is just so that Shadow can understand these packages as ES modules. So JavaScript that supports the import and export syntax. And I believe without too much configuration, the default for tsconfig will output ES modules. So just to be safe. And now at this point, we do need this directory to exist. So let's make a new folder called packages. And then inside of packages, you want to create a folder for what you're calling the npm package that you created, which according to my tsconfig, I called it UI. Maybe not the best name, but it gets the job done. And then the last step for Shadow to actually recognize that this directory is an npm package is that it needs a package JSON of its own. So you'll want to cd into it and do an npm init-y. This will automatically create a npm package or a package JSON file. And you can update this if you need to. I think all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get rid of this scripts thing, and I might change type to module, but that's everything that should work. Now back to tsconfig, I need to explain the pathing here. By default, Shadcn uses path aliases, so we're gonna add all of our components into the same kind of directory naming convention, which is all of our TSX code or TypeScript code is going to live in a directory called TSX. That is a subdirectory of our source directory. And then with all of that, I believe we could do let's install a button again. So let's do our first, I guess the accordion was my last import. So let's add the accordion using the Shadcn CLI. I'm in the wrong directory. Okay, let's try that again. This should be our components JSON and our tsconfig. And since we're using React 19, it's gonna ask you for this little thing. I always just do legacy peer deps. I think it's safer. Yeah, that should install the accordion. It only installed the accordion, so I guess we do need to add the util. Is it lib or libs? Oh, okay, just singular. And we'll grab this, paste it into our new lib-utils file, and then now we can build all of these TypeScript components into the npm package. So the root project's package JSON, I created a new script here that we'll call TSC, so TypeScript compile, and it'll compile everything according to our tsconfig. So now if we run this code, we should now have the JS files inside of package UI, and here's the raw JSX. Now there is one issue with the TypeScript compilation, and it's that it didn't expand the path aliases. And since path aliasing is all over Shadcn, rather than changing them to relative paths in our own codebase, we should just use another tool called TSC alias, and this will just, in the compilation step, expand the path aliases so that it'll match and it'll be a relative. So now if we rerun build UI, this should fix everything. So let me check the accordion, and now we have ... which is technically what we want. The accordion is a little annoying to showcase in video because there's so many different layers of it. So I'm just gonna go with input. This will be an easier example to show. Once again, I'm gonna rebuild my component library. And now in your code, you can refer all your components where the root package is the name of the directory name. And you still want to respect the pathing, so it'll be UI components /UI /input. And I guess I'll just put it here under the H1. I don't think we really want to add any props, but let's test this out after it builds, of course. Okay, and there's our input, perfectly styled. And it's working, so let's also check that our class names from the Reagent side is able to overwrite. So in our code, I don't really know what to put in here. Let's make it a huge input. So text is 4XL. And since it is an input, let's also do a console log of the target value. Okay, still small, but it's logging out correctly. I think I just used the wrong class name for this, but I'm still satisfied with showing this. And then a final small tip: if you don't like the way this pathing looks, You can always just add an index.ts at the root of the tsx source directory and then export everything at the root. The only downside to this is that you just have to manually do it every time you add a new component. But now when you build, there's an index.js, and it does alleviate the redundancy in the imports of inside your ClojureScript app. So no longer do you have to do UI/components/UI, it's just UI. If you enjoy this kind of content, consider subscribing and liking the video. And if you want to support me in other ways, you can always buy me a coffee. Thank you for watching.